Good afternoon. My name is Shelley Rogers, and I am the coordinator for Fashion for the Earth at earthday.org. Welcome to the Emperor's New Clothes, an interview with Kenneth Pucker. The title of our interview, and possibly future ones, is named for the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, of course, about how a very vain emperor who has an obsession with fancy new clothes that he spends lavishly on is swindled by two unscrupulous weavers. They convince him that only those who are not fools can see these magnificent clothes. So the emperor and his court all pretend to see these amazing garments, and then, not wanting to be fools, the townspeople also pretend to see them when the emperor parades through their streets, until, that is, a child in the crowd cries out, "Wait a second, the emperor's not actually wearing any clothes." I don't think that's verbatim in the story, but everybody in the story believed what they were told to believe, and believed because they thought everyone else believed. The fact is that today we are in many ways being fooled about our clothes and told to believe what others believe, and we tend to go along. But like the child, it's the voices that soar above the accepting crowd that tell the truth we really need to hear. Today, we welcome one such voice in Kenneth Pucker, who we are very, very pleased to have with us. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. I'm going to read your bio, a very shortened version of your bio for our time. Ken is an operator, investment professional, educator, advisor, board member, and thought leader with a focus on sustainability and fashion. His work has appeared in many periodicals, including Harvard Business Review, Stanford Social Innovation Review, Institutional Investor, just to name a few. Ken has been an advisory director at Berkshire Partners since 2010, a founding member of the firm's Responsible Investing Committee. He acts as a principal expert advisor on environment, social, and governance matters for the portfolio. He's also an adjunct professor of business administration at Dartmouth's Tuck School of Business, and is a professor of practice at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. From 1992 to 2007, Ken worked at Timberland, the well-known shoe company, and for 7 years as the company's chief operating officer. He began his career as a municipal finance analyst at Goldman Sachs and worked as a research associate at the Brookings Institution. So welcome again, Ken. Ken, I'm going to start off with, I guess, your beginnings, I would say. You started out at Goldman Sachs after college, but eventually decided to get your master's in management from the Sloan School of Management at MIT. And there you won a contest that took you to Japan, where you witnessed what's called just-in-time manufacturing. And you have said that you were just beguiled by this, meaning the idea of making things. Eventually, you went to Timberland, but not because it was a fashion company, but because of this interest. Can you tell us, what was this fascination then?
Well, thank you for having me. You're right to say that I started my career in finance. And when I went to graduate school at Sloan, I thought I would graduate from Sloan and end up back in finance. But between years, I was able to go on a trip for 10 days to Japan and Korea. And we visited with 10 different manufacturers, from Sony to Busan Steel, Nissan, Toyota, etc. And I, as you rightly noted, was beguiled by just-in-time manufacturing. For those not old enough to remember, this was 1990, and Japan, from a manufacturing standpoint, was what China is today, and was taking enormous market share from the US. And having visited the factories, it wasn't clear to me why the US couldn't adopt a similar approach to manufacturing, which is just-in-time or Kaizen manufacturing. And so between years at school, I shifted my focus and decided to work at Bain & Company. They had a group then called Bain Advanced Manufacturing. And I worked at an auto company in Detroit for the summer. And upon graduation, then decided to shift focus from finance to making things. You're right to note I ended up at Timberland, not because of fashion, but because it made things. At the time, Timberland was a manufacturer of 100% of its own footwear in its own factories, which made it an outlier. Timberland had factories then in Boone, North Carolina, Mountain City, Tennessee, Isabela, Puerto Rico, and Santiago in Dominican Republic. And my first job there was working for the second generation CEO family member to schedule the factories.
Oh, um, you worked, as you said, and you just said at Timberland, and the CEO was part of the family that owned the companies. But from 2002 onward, every quarter he would report to shareholders and the press, and he included something that other companies did not include, which was CSR, or corporate social responsibility reporting. And can you talk about what that is and why this made Timberland an outlier? Why was it unusual, and how was it received?
So I mentioned that Timberland was run by 3 generations of the same family, the Swartz family. The company was privately controlled but publicly traded. So it was traded on the New York Stock Exchange. The 3rd generation leader whom you are describing is Jeff Swartz, and he was overeducated. He went to Brown undergrad, pre-med, and then to Tuck. And by the time he ascended to CEO, he'd already been at the company for 15 years and candidly was, I think, bored with traditional budget meetings and marketing meetings and product sessions. And at the same time, he'd found faith. And so in the year 2000, he changed the mission of the company to be what he called equal parts commerce and justice. Justice is a big word to be using in 2025 in context with business. This was in the year 2000. And justice for Jeff was comprised of 3 components: global human rights, citizen service, and environmental stewardship. And so you're right to note that on quarterly conference calls with Wall Street every 90 days, Jeff devoted a third of his prepared script to Timberland's justice agenda, detailing what progress we were making, to include things like giving all of our employees 40 hours of paid leave for community service. We were the first public company in the world to do that. We powered our factories with renewable energy. We installed the largest solar array in the state of California at the time, many, many other things. And notwithstanding his commitment to this vision for 28 straight quarters, the Wall Street interlocutors on the other side of the phone were much more interested in our gross margins and our revenue growth and our profit performance than they were the justice agenda at Timberland. So he literally never received a question about that third of his remarks.
It's kind of hard to believe, really, but as we go on, we'll probably see why that's true. I want to know about these 3 pillars and how were these actually implemented by Timberland? And maybe more importantly, what was the net result in terms of their impact on the environment, if any?
So, great question. Timberland did not have a foundation. It was important to Jeff not to separate the work of doing well from doing good. And so all of our justice activities were funded through a traditional budget process. And we had leaders within the different functional units of the company responsible for each of these 3 areas, with specific focus or reference to the environment. Timberland made a number of wonderful leaps. It was one of the co-founders of the leading multi-stakeholder initiative in the industry at the time called the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. It was also a founding member of a group called the Leather Working Group, which was another multi-stakeholder initiative that worked to rate and then upgrade the standards of our tanneries. The company was also committed to remediating its carbon footprint, like most companies have tried to do. And if you looked at our CSR reports every year, you'd find that during the time that I served as COO, our carbon emissions went down by double digits every year, while at the same time our revenues grew by double digits, which is a cool trick if you can actually pull it off. Not many companies can, but essentially decoupling growth from emissions growth. But if you were careful, you would read the footnotes on our CSR report and note that the emissions that we were reporting on were our scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are our direct emissions. So emissions associated with keeping the lights on in the building or driving cars to and from work, where our scope 2 emissions were our emissions associated with purchased electricity. Scope 3 emissions, though, are the value chain emissions, how material gets made, how product ends up in use. And for most footwear and apparel companies, scope 3 is between 95 and 98% of total. And the emissions I referenced before as the ones that were declining were only the scope 1 and 2 emissions.
Mm-hmm.
And we told you that in our report, but the reason we didn't track scope 3 at the time was because it was very difficult. You needed to calculate 60,000 data points every 6 months. And there wasn't standardized software to do that in order to have a sense of what your scope 3 emissions were. And so now it's better. There are software providers who will either estimate or do this work. But at the same time, because non-financial or sustainability reporting remains voluntary in this country, even today, less than half of the publicly traded companies, forget even private, but publicly traded companies report on their scope 3 emissions, which is to say, we're not collectively, as this country, and actually globally, even measuring yet what our total footprint is, let alone disclosing it, let alone activating to reduce it.
I see. Well, this next question, you may have just answered this next question. As you said, CSR has evolved, becoming now ESG, environmental and social governance. And you said 2 decades later, from that time at Timberland, all public fashion companies present their ESG performance in ever thicker, glossier forms. And of course, you're an expert in ESG investing and reporting. In what way is ESG any different from CSR? And is it an improvement? You said that there may be platforms now you can use to get to scope 3. Is that the improvement? Has anything changed in that switch from CSR to ESG? Maybe that's just my lack of understanding.
No, the acronym soup is actually very confusing. I would tell you that CSR and ESG are in fact very different things. CSR, I like to think about as the corporate side of sustainability, while ESG is more the investment side of sustainability. ESG came about in 2004. It was first named in a UN report called Who Cares Wins, that was published by an aggregate of 20 different investment firms at the request of the UN to try to see how investment capital might be used to further advance social and environmental outcomes. And over time, very little happened until about mid-2010s, when a series of academic papers were published that linked the equity returns of high sustainability companies to their stock market performance. And when that happened, you started to build up an infrastructure of rating firms, ESG rating firms, that would rate companies on their environmental, social, and governance performance, such that asset management firms could group essentially high-rated ESG companies into public market mutual funds that investors could buy into. And so the selling point from the asset management firms was, well, we have this research that says that doing well and doing good do go together, and they deliver better equity returns. And if you're an investor who's concerned about the state of the planet, wouldn't it be nice if you could find an investment that actually delivered better financial performance or equity returns and did some good for the planet? That's what ESG was focused on. Unfortunately, for many, many reasons, including the fact that the original research turned out to be flawed, ESG investment turned out to be an illusion, I think. It was a way for asset management firms to increase their fees because ESG funds carried higher fees, but they didn't deliver ultimately better returns, nor did they actually deliver any impact for the planet. So they turned out to be, unfortunately, an illusion, I think.
Yeah. And of course, in the meantime, our global emissions have just gone in a straight line up. If you look at Apparel Impact Institute, what they're saying, that they're going to soar by 40% by the close of the decade. So, I mean, I guess that in and of itself is almost the answer. If it's getting worse and worse, then
I wouldn't blame that on the failure, or my view of the failure of ESG investing.
Mhm.
The growth of emissions is more systemic and structural, unfortunately. It is not that executives are bad people or that consumers don't care or that investors don't care. It's just that the system that fashion companies operate in, just like car companies and furniture manufacturers, is one that values revenue growth and profit growth ahead
Yeah.
of non-financial factors.
Right.
And if you're told as an executive that the way you retain your job or get paid a bonus is by achieving ever more in terms of unit sales, then that's what your primary focus is going to be, not whether your water intensity improved or whether your carbon emissions declined.
Yeah. I guess we're going to get to that in my questions about the barriers to sustainability, but I want to talk about a time period, two time periods actually that you have talked about. The first one is, of course, we are earthday.org, and we're the organization that came out of the first Earth Day in 1970. In fact, our 55th anniversary is just coming up in a matter of weeks. And you talk about how that time around the first Earth Day, that the prevailing wisdom then was to coexist with nature, and so business had to be regulated. And in fact, coming directly after the first Earth Day, where 20 million people marched, there was, under President Nixon, he immediately signed into law the Environmental Protection Act. That same year, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, then the Clean Water Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Superfund. I mean, it's all seminal legislation. But something that I find so interesting is that 2 years after the first Earth Day in 1972, you pointed out that the first World Conference to make the environment a major issue occurred, which was the 1972 United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, which is held in Stockholm. And in that same year, a group of systems dynamicists at MIT published a treatise called The Limits to Growth. And these PhDs came to three conclusions if present growth were to continue unchanged. Can you talk about this treatise? And what factors were they looking at that time? And what were their conclusions?
Yeah, I think 1972 is a seminal year for the reasons you described, both the Stockholm Conference and the publication of the book, Limits to Growth. Limits to Growth was written by husband and wife, Danella and Dennis Meadows. It was the work of 16 researchers with an average age of 26 and a half who worked under the direction of Jay Forrester at MIT, using new computing power and a new discipline called systems dynamics to look over time at 13 scenarios of the interaction of 5 variables. They were resources, food per capita, population and industrial output per capita, and pollution. And they used these simulations to map out between 1970s and really 2100 what might happen under different growth assumptions and conditions and different assumptions around ability to steward resources. And they did come to 3 conclusions in this report. The first was that if growth continued on the same trajectory, we were headed for some kind of economic and environmental ecological collapse sometime this century. But they thought the report was actually optimistic because it said that we still had time in 1972 to alter these trends such that we could assure a stable future focused on well-being for everyone. And their third message was if you have 30 days to fix a crisis, don't start on day 29, meaning get started immediately. And notwithstanding the technical nature of the treatise that they published, it was incredibly popular and controversial. It sold over 10 million copies and was translated in over 30 languages. And it remains a source, I think, of inspiration in large part because many of the concerns that were evinced in the book have actually manifest over time.
It's amazing. I guess some people also saw it as a doomsday. I mean, like you're saying, it was controversial. Some people saw it as doomsday. And yet
some people saw it as doomsday. The Catholic Church in particular didn't like it because they thought it was a prescription to limit population growth through contraception. Economists didn't like it because it considered limits in its calculations, whereas economists typically don't. So it was a new way of thinking. Two Nobel Prize-winning economists wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, decrying the work of the limits to growth paper, and so it was very controversial.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I'm going to try to get a copy of it. This next question is in several parts, but I want to jump ahead to 1987, which is just 15 years later. And actually, some people may think that's a long time. If you're very young, you think that's a long time. Not historically. It's just really hop, skip, and a jump, to 15 years. But this mindset that came about during the 1970s and that way of thinking changed in a major way. I wonder if you can talk about the Brundtland Commission report, which was published that year, which was in the 1987 by the World Commission on Environment and Development, which you have said included the first definition of sustainability. What was its definition, and how was it different than the general wisdom and understanding that had existed for 15 years?
Well, you rightly noted that the general accepted convention 15 and 20 years prior was that business had to be regulated in order to preserve and keep the environment. And the legislative accomplishments of the early 70s that you rendered is a reflection of that. But by 1987, you're right to note that the thinking had changed. And over that period of time, the UN, in concert with the International Chamber of Commerce, had really floated and adopted a separate theory, which was that the best way to assure environmental security was by letting businesses tend to the environment as opposed to be regulated. And this theory is based on 4 different platforms. The first is that businesses were the ones who were the innovators. And so the innovation needed to, for example, convert our energy systems would come from the commercial environment. The second was that businesses would report on non-financial impacts, and that would lead to a race to the top because there'd be competition around who would be the best environmental steward or who'd be the most active company in terms of social justice. The third rationale was that certification schemes would emerge that would help consumers pressure companies to do the right set of things. And the last was that there were a whole series of win-win solutions that would both advance planetary welfare and also profitability. Things like creating shared value or eco-efficiency or the negawatt revolution or fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, or all these ideas, most of which were emanate from universities, were considered to be breakthrough and demonstrative of the possibility of win-wins. Mm-hmm. And so by 1987, the Brundtland Commission, at the behest of the UN, came up with a new definition of sustainability, which was development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And in some senses, it's a good definition, because what we do care about, or should care about, I think, is the viability of the planet for our kids and grandkids and their children. And the definition does take into account the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But it also starts with this word development, which is a code really for growth. And the thinking was that growth, or green growth, and the technology associated with it was a better bet than regulation as a way to secure the future.
Right. And you've also said that, on top of this, there was this whole political zeitgeist at the time working toward this shift in balancing business and regulation. I mean, the people in power then were Reagan and Thatcher. So I guess there was also, it was the confluence of many, many different things going on. So that's
an excellent point. I mean, the zeitgeist and backdrop was a deregulatory one. Mm-hmm. You right to note Thatcher and Reagan and Milton Friedman and the advent of neoliberalism, which was a response really to World War II and concerns about the viability or lack thereof of socialist or communist forms of governance. And so the pendulum swung from a state-controlled economy essentially to a neoliberal view, which was one that was much more deregulated and in the hands of business. And so you're right to note that the evolution of thinking had a backdrop that was really influential, that helped also shape the definition of sustainability.
Right. So now things have really shifted, and from 1970 and 1987, with the idea that we can have what you've called win-win solutions led by the market. And so we get something that you have coined a phrase for, which I really like, called Sustainability Inc. And I think there should be an exclamation point after that. It should be a Sustainability Inc. exclamation, because everybody is in on it. Business is in on it, investment community, NGOs, fashion companies, sustainability departments, various consortiums, and so on. Can you talk about, what is Sustainability Inc.'s main idea that you have said is rooted in hope? And then maybe more importantly, what is the driver or drivers behind Sustainability Inc.?
Well, Sustainability Inc. is a convention. You're right to note that I came up with the phrase. It doesn't exist per se. It is, to me, it's an aggregation of like-minded actors, most of whom are really well-intentioned and who want to assure a safe future for their kids and grandkids. And they may work in a consulting firm focused on helping companies report on their CSR reports. They may work at a investment firm developing ESG products. They may work at in the academy doing research on the links between sustainable practices and profits. There's all these different actors who are all seeking to play a role in assuring a safe future, but what they're really doing, I think, sometimes unbeknownst to themselves, is creating a cover for a system which perpetuates the same kind of behavior. We are not talking enough about the structural reform and rulemaking reform and incentive reform that's clearly needed in order to better balance the unspoken needs of the planet with the very real demands to continue to grow profits and revenues at companies. And so each of these actors creates a kind of self-reinforcing loop that advocates for a market-based approach. And we now have, 50 years or at least 30 years of good evidence that says a market-based approach that is founded on reporting and certification and win-win solutions in technology can make incremental progress, but it's subsumed in terms of environmental impacts by what I would describe as business as usual.
Well, you have written so many great pieces. I have them all saved. But something that everybody should read is your article in Business of Fashion called Circularity is a Fashionable Fantasy, and also one I can't get into it, Harvard Business Review. I can't get into it, called The Circle That Is Not Squared. I think I have the wrong title there, but so the hope is that business again is going to drive circularity, and so that the drivers behind Sustainability Inc. are really circularity and circular systems. You have outlined 7 specific barriers that you say make circularity impossible. If you go into any brand, the site of any brand, you'll read. They all have now a sustainable section. You can read all about their circular things that they're doing. But there are, you're saying, 7 barriers that make this actually impossible, and you've dissected into 7 parts. So I might just interject here that I think the first one of the 7 is kind of the mothership, but because it kind of seems to encompass a lot of them in a sense. So could you talk about the 7 barriers? What they are?
Sure. A couple notes. First, the article that you were referring to is called A Circle That Isn't Easily Squared, and
Right.
it's in Stanford Social Innovation Review.
Sorry.
And it's actually interesting because they not only published the article, they published, I think, 7 or 8 expert responses to the article and then gave me a chance to respond to them. So they devoted a lot of real estate to the question.
So I'm going to have to subscribe.
The second point is that I don't want to confuse circularity with sustainability. Circularity is one strategy that can be employed to try to deliver sustainable outcomes. And there are many others, but it's just one. And in the case of fashion, it's one that I would describe as in vogue. And what circularity, why it's so popular, is because what it tries to do is demonstrate that there can be a decoupling of revenue growth, which companies continue to seek, and resource use. And if you can decouple the two, the theory is you can continue to grow but at the same time, lessen the impact on the planet. So many big brands, multi-billion-dollar brands, have goals that say things like, we are going to double our revenue growth over the next 8 years. And at the same time, we're going to cut our environmental impacts in half by deploying circular systems. Things like keeping apparel in use for longer periods of time via things like repair or reuse or resale, secondhand clothing shops, recycling, upcycling. These are strategies that are all specific initiatives under the umbrella of circularity, which again is one strategy to assure that businesses can remain sustainable. But there are challenges with circularity, at least as relates to fashion. And to be clear, circularity does work in certain other industries because they may be characterized by different economics. For example, the steel industry or the aluminum industry or the packaging paper industry all have very high recycling rates and reuse rates of inputs. But in the case of fashion, less than 1% of fashion, which is today about 150 billion units, are shipped annually. Less than 1% of those units are remade from old fashion, which is, part of what a circular system would make happen. And the reason there's such a gap between the aspiration and the intention is manifold. First, the mothership you described relates to all industry, which is that absent a change in system structure, incentives, or goals, behavior is unlikely to change. And in our case, the system that we operate in, that kind of what I would describe as reasonably unfettered or unregulated capitalism, growth is the oxygen of capitalism, that kind of capitalism. And if that isn't restricted in some fashion, then we're going to get mostly the same kind of behaviors. The second is that most of the measures on circularity are discretionary and they differ across companies. And so we don't have a singular, even North Star to define what success looks like. The third is that recycling or upcycling actually oftentimes degrades the product in fashion. So for example, cotton, which can be recycled, when you upcycle cotton into a new cotton garment, the staple fiber actually shrinks in size. And so the cotton is not as valuable. And that's a problem that is specific to the fibers in fashion. The fourth challenge is that the business models that have been adopted to try to assure circular practices have yet to scale. So one that has scaled a little bit is secondhand clothing. We've had Goodwill and places like that for years, but the advent of the internet has created a number of different startups like ThredUp and The RealReal, which have grown. Unfortunately, they haven't grown in terms of profit. They continue to lose money. And ultimately, a for-profit business needs to generate positive cash flow in order to endure. And so I'm concerned about the viability or, quote, sustainability economically of those models. Also, most of these new business systems like secondhand clothing or resale remain small as a percent of total. So an example of that is Patagonia started their Worn program probably more than a decade ago. And they're a great brand who really is committed to these outcomes. and resale still represents less than 2% of their overall sales volume while they continue to grow. And so the scalability of some of these models is what I would describe as a fourth barrier. A fifth challenge is that it's hard to amass feedstocks for recycling in an economic way. So how do you get the stuff back to recycle? What's the collection mechanism? And then is there infrastructure in place in order to support that collection? It's another problem. And final problem is that a lot of the technologies don't yet exist for upcycling of fashion. Most fashion today are what are called blends. So your cotton jeans probably have stretch in them now, which is a synthetic fiber called elastane. And we don't yet have a recycling technology that can separate fibers that is deployed in any kind of scale. One last challenge is just the math. It's very inexpensive to buy virgin polyester. Polyester, for those who don't know, or nylon, these synthetic materials emanate from oil, literally fossil fuels. The way Google, how does one make polyester, and you'll see that it's oil that's been spun and extruded and turned into a thread. And polyester has grown markedly over the last 25 years, such that synthetics now represent more than 70% of all fashion on Earth. Or said differently, most fashion is made from oil. And it's a byproduct of the fossil fuel industry. And there's massive excess capacity, especially in China, but some now in the US, for producing polyester. And so the prices are very low. So it's very difficult for upcycled or recycled fabrics to compete with the virgin fabric. So these are all reasons why good intentions on circularity have been hard to translate into practice when it comes to fashion.
Mm-hmm. And you've also talked about a lack of collaboration is another problem with, I guess, the complex and fragmented supply chains.
So in fashion, the fashion industry itself has created a system or a structure for its supply chains that make decarbonization and other environmental progress very difficult. Mm-hmm. And the reason is, it used to be like when I started at Timberland, I said we made 100% of our own footwear. Well, today, very few brands still manufacture their own output. Most production is outsourced to complex, global, multi-tiered supply chains with multiple nodes. And so if you're a company and you're interested in decarbonizing, you really have to do it in concert with your suppliers, the ones who are making your stuff, because that's where the carbon emanates from. And yet you don't have a financial incentive to do it because they're not your factories that you'd be investing in to decarbonize. You share them with other industry participants. And so you say to yourself, well, why should I help the supplier swap out their coal-fired boiler at a cost of $2 million if I'm only getting 1/20th of the benefit? Because I'm sharing the factory with others. And the suppliers themselves typically don't have the borrowing capacity or financial wherewithal to make these investments on their own. And so we end up with, unfortunately, a bit of a stalemate where the brands are making commitments to decarbonization. They're pushing the responsibility for that decarbonization to their suppliers, but their suppliers don't have the bandwidth or capital or commitments for stable orders that make them willing to do the work of decarbonization. And so, though we have solutions that actually would decarbonize the space, they're not being deployed nearly fast enough to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is, of course, that there are hundreds of these factories. I mean, I think H&M has 1,300, something like that, in just tier 1, when, of course, most of the pollution is in tier 2, tier 3, and so on. But so many hundreds and hundreds of factories. What I think I'm going to move on now. That was covered so well by you, Ken. I want to talk about the Fashion Act. Earth Day has been a big supporter of the Fashion Act from the beginning. And, so what we've been talking about is that up until now, governments have not really been involved. So we just keep moving forward inch by inch, doing less harm by this or that. And we avoid problems with our usual business model that way. That isn't really actually improving anything hugely. So, it's not illogical to say that we need now maybe to return to the era of the first Earth Day in 1970, where we believe that regulation was the answer. And we may be beginning to have that now. But as I say, Earth Day has been a big backer of the Fashion Act, but you play a very big part as a primary supporter through all of your efforts around the Fashion Act, writing, speaking, and of course, advising. You've been working with New Standard Institute and Maxime Bédat, one of the architects of the Fashion Act, and the legislators to secure passage of the act, which is now sitting in the New York State Assembly and in the Senate. I guess I'll ask kind of a bit of a general question at first. Can you talk about why this is such an important piece of legislation?
Sure. I want to be clear that I think legislation, regulation, new rules are an important part of the solution, not the entirety of it. And I also want to be clear that regulation that is ill-conceived can actually do more damage than good. In this case, I do think there's a need for rules that govern the fashion industry because, as I mentioned prior, it's a pretty big industry, multi-trillion-dollar industry that goes almost completely unregulated, at least in the United States. And so Maxine, who you mentioned, is a lawyer. She's also the author of a great book that traces the birth to death of a pair of jeans from a West Texas cotton field to a dump in Ghana. And she's the founder of a group called NGO called the New Standard Institute, which is a principal backer of the New York Fashion Act. The Fashion Act says essentially three things. One, it mandates that companies perform due diligence on multiple tiers, all the tiers of their supply chain, to assure that their suppliers are behaving in concert with OECD requirements when it comes to social and environmental compliance. The second thing it says is that brands, this only pertains to brands with revenues in excess of $100 million globally that choose to sell in the state of New York. But for such brands, they have to report on a number of key measures publicly in a shared format on their websites every year. They have to tell you things as a consumer or an investor, like what percentage of recycled materials did they use, how many units did they produce, what was their carbon footprint across all three scopes of emissions, how much water did they use, things like that, straightforward things that can be used to compare across companies and over time. And the third thing it requires is that brands be approved by and adhere to an NGO's work, the Science Based Targets Initiative, which mandates that approved companies deliver a plan that has them reducing their emissions in keeping with planetary boundaries or science. It doesn't allow companies to say, well, this year we think we'll reduce by 4%, next year by 2%, the following year they'll go up by 7%, then down by 3%. It says the planet has a certain requirement that science says that unless we decarbonize at a certain rate, global temperatures will continue to go up. They're already up over 1.5 degrees Celsius. And Science-Based Target says, deliver me a plan that says you can reduce your emissions in keeping with a 2-degree future. And so they're an independent NGO unrelated to the Fashion Act or the New Standard Institute that separately audits and validates these plans. So the third platform of the Fashion Act says you must be approved by science-based targets and you must adhere annually to the requirements, which calls for reductions on the order of 5 or 6% a year across scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions. The Act also says if you don't comply with any of these provisions, the New York State Attorney General, at his or her discretion, can fine a company up to 2% of revenues. And so if you're a company like Timberland size, when I was there, that would be close to a $40 million fine if you didn't comply, which will get a CFO and CEO's attention. There is a period for remediation. If in fact you haven't complied before, a fine will be imposed. The idea isn't to raise money from fines. It's instead to put teeth behind the need to lift the floor in the industry such that brands do collaborate, such that we do get legitimate decarbonization, as opposed to strategies that are hopeful but don't ultimately deliver.
Well, that's a great description of the Fashion Act. It really is. Well, you may have already, in your answer just now, answered the next question, but it's the next question is, I read an article very recently. Well, it actually was published a little bit less than a year ago in Fordham's Intellectual Property, Media, and Entertainment Law Journal. And regarding Gen Z and millennials vis-a-vis the Fashion Act, it said, there does not appear to be any confusion that fast fashion is environmentally and socially irresponsible and harmful. So if many consumers know that what they're doing is socially and environmentally irresponsible and harmful, but continue to engage in this activity, how will increased disclosure of harmful practices make any meaningful impact on them? So
it's a great point. I don't think alone disclosure will suffice. So that's why the theory of change represented by the Act isn't just a disclosure bill. It doesn't just say, tell us what your emissions are. It says you must remediate. You must reduce your emissions or be subject to a fine. And so I agree with the Fordham Journal that says disclosure alone is insufficient.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. As part of the process of what you've been doing to help the Fashion Act or be part of the process, you have engaged with scores of industry participants, stakeholders, including brands, suppliers, trade associations, unions, activists. You have said that the conversations that you've had with them have been very constructive, but there was also consternation about it. What was the biggest blowback from the brands you talked to in the past year?
Well, importantly, you note that the conversations have been across all players in the space, all stakeholders. We have unions who support the Act. We have politicians, obviously. We have innovators who are trying via the win-win strategy to come up with technical solutions that advance progress. We have suppliers, we have brands, etc. The most frustrating part is the absence of endorsement from big brands that are public. We have a number of wonderful brands, all private brands that are supporters, brands like that you've heard of, like Reformation and Faraday and Everlane and Cotopaxi and Patagonia and Eileen Fisher and Stella McCartney and Ghani, and great brands. But big public companies are more reluctant. So when we talk to them, they understand the need for regulation and they understand the need for rules in order to lift the floor, especially sustainability departments who know absent such rules, they won't have as much leverage with their leadership at companies. But most companies are loath to be regulated, and they're certainly not interested in being regulated if there's a fine that's potentially out there that could be attached. And so it's not surprising, but the scale trade associations and biggest players in the industry are either unwilling to be supportive publicly, and there are some companies and trade associations that are actively lobbying against the regulation.
Right. I want to jump now to the European Union, because this is happening at the same time everything's happening there as well. And the major legislation that was passed between January and June of last year, there is a pushback now, pretty big pushback to the new legislation, including what's called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or commonly called the CSDDD, which is similar to the Fashion Act. And the pushback is very strong, particularly from Germany and France. And originally, the pushback was about I thought, was about the redundancy and all the different reporting requirements. You have to, this piece of legislation requires you to report this way. There are many of them, CSRD, CSDDD, EU taxonomy, and other reporting. So it seemed like maybe this is just a movement that could be handled by simply consolidating the reporting into maybe what they're calling now an omnibus bill. But more concerning is that there's now been a push from the United States, from a Republican congressman and several organizations, including what we were talking about before, the International Chamber of Commerce. Now it's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce with the American Petroleum Institute, speaking of clothes being made of oil, and the National Association of Manufacturers, that they're saying that this reporting is just too difficult for our US manufacturers. And so it does appear that this is all going to be scaled back. How do you think this is going to be, how do you think it's going to affect the Fashion Act in New York and possibly the two other Fashion Acts in our country, the one in Massachusetts and the newest one in California? And what is your, yeah.
To be clear, the Fashion Acts you described in California, Massachusetts, is also one in Washington State now, are intended to be replicas of the New York Fashion Act. We're not trying to create different sets of rules by state. Ideally, we'd have one set of rules, which would be federal, but that's very difficult to achieve right now, given the political landscape. The omnibus you described in Europe has ultimately, they've landed on a very dramatically scaled back version of the bills you were describing, the CSRD and the CSDDD. In the case of the CSDDD, which was focused on due diligence and supply chains, one example that would impact fashion that's, I think, pretty fundamental is the prior version of CSDDD mandated that brands were responsible for due diligence of their supply chains across all tiers, tier 1 through 4. So that's from, let's say, cotton growing to finished production. The new version, which is in process now, makes them only responsible for the tier 1 of their supply chain, which represents probably 10 to 20% of the work that goes on in their supply chain. And so you're right to note there's been a dramatic scale back, and the shift right politically in Europe and in this country is certainly not favorable to regulation, which makes it the New York passage of the New York Fashion Act an additional challenge. I should note that the states in which we're pursuing the act are ones that are more left-leaning than right-leaning in terms of their legislatures and governors. And so that's why they've been chosen, that and their scale. Because if you're a brand, you can't have a supply chain for New York versus Idaho. And so getting a bill passed in California or New York would be de facto federal legislation.
Yeah. So is your hope, what is your hope? Do you see these regulations, including Fashion Act, although they're facing this resistance, ultimately, it may be in time that these are maybe not too distant future are going to prevail and have a significant impact?
Yes, I mean, I do think they'll prevail. It's a question of time and really energy and money. As I mentioned before, trade associations and some major brands lobby actively against passage of these bills. And so New Standard Institute needs to do a better job of being an active fundraiser such that we can communicate to assure that legislators have a more complete view of the pluses and minuses of the legislation. But I think as the industry continues to grow and its impacts become more profound and the planet feels smaller and more at risk, that increases the likelihood of passage.
Okay. All right. I want to ask this question now that we have this legislation going on. My next question is this really enough? I looked it up, and the average dress in 1970 was $20, but that would be $167 today. We're not really paying the true cost of our clothes any longer. You've written about fashion and the need for taxation. You've talked about earlier taxation, which was used for good. What kind of tax would it be? How could clothing be taxed? And why would it be a step in the right direction?
So clothing between the year 2000 and today, in real terms, has actually gotten less expensive, not more. When I say real terms, I'm saying inflation-adjusted terms. So whereas something like education and healthcare have gone up considerably in real terms, clothing is actually in real terms cheaper today. So why would taxation make a difference? Well, if you look at what are described in economics as market failures, things like externalities or side effects of production that aren't actually incorporated in anyone's price are a market failure. So when a company, for example, emits CO2 and doesn't pay for it, the society actually pays for it. if we want to reach what would be a more socially optimal level of production, we have to include the costs, the social costs of these market failures in the costs of production in order to get to a better outcome.
Mhm.
And so a carbon tax, for example, as long as it was sufficiently large and consistent with the real cost of carbon, would be one tool that we could use to assure that the externalities or real side effects of production, the environmental negatives, actually are included, which would increase prices, which would dampen demand.
Mhm. I see. I have other questions about taxation, but I want to just quickly jump to my last few questions. You have written so well. I urge everyone to read your article on the lingering cost of instant fashion, and that is Harvard Business Review. I've got that one right. I want to talk about Shein. You have said in that particular article that which all of these questions are based on here, that Shein and Temu, the two major brands from China now, represent a disruption to the fashion business model. What are the ways that it's disrupting it?
So if you go back again to around turn of the century, two brands really, Zara and H&M, disrupted fashion by creating what became known as a fast fashion model. And their principal insight was that if you want people to buy more, you should give them more opportunities to see more new product. And so if you're a consumer walking by a street in Valencia and you want to walk into an H&M store, if they only deliver product twice a year, there's not a lot of incentive to go in apart from when those new deliveries come into the store. Well, if they deliver 24 times a year, maybe on your walk home from work, you stop by more frequently. And both H&M and Zara developed really innovative and complex and exceptionally well-run supply chains that were able to deliver product much more frequently and with better forecasting tools and shorter lead times, minimize markdowns such that they were able to generate outsized profits. And they were very, very successful commercially. In 2012, Shein started, which is a Chinese company, and they actually took the fast fashion model and put it on steroids or supercharged it. They, instead of delivering product, 24 times a year, they deliver product every day. And they deliver, in fact, so much new product. They deliver on average about 5,000 to 6,000 new styles a day on their site, which is the equivalent over a week in what Zara delivers in a year. And they do it at price points that are about half those of H&M, Gap, and Zara. And it's 80% of the product, 70-80% of the product is made from oil, from synthetics. And so they, using this supercharged, what I called instant fashion model, have been able to take market share and grow such that they've now become the fastest growing fashion company in history. They've gone from nothing in 2012 to over $40 billion today and are considering going public. Temu is a follower that has a similar model. And because of the success of the model, other companies have emulated it. There's a new launch, for example, from Amazon called Amazon Haul, which is all products on Amazon Haul are available at under $20. And so you can buy a pair of jeans on, let's say, Shein or one of these other sites for $12 or a 6-pack of socks for $8. I mean, prices that are heretofore inconceivable. And most of this stuff gets used for shorter and shorter periods of time because it's so inexpensive, it's almost disposable. And that ends up clogging our landfills or getting incinerated.
Yes. You have said that, I guess I only have time for a couple more questions. You've said that instant fashion, as practiced by Shein and increasingly its competitors, is propelled by two big technological and behavioral shifts. Can you explain what those two things are?
Well, the technological shift that they use, certainly the availability to speak directly to consumers, not via stores, but via e-commerce, is an important change. They also ship product directly to your doorstep from China using air freight principally. And the reason they do this is because there's a provision in the US tax code called the de minimis provision, which allows for shipments of under $800 to be shipped direct from overseas to a customer's door, uh, passing over the rules associated with duties. And the law actually existed so that foreign travelers could send stuff back to their homes duty-free. But these Chinese companies figured out that if they were able to ship product directly to consumers at under $800, they could leverage this same de minimis provision, thereby avoiding paying duties, which has two impacts. One is their product is cheaper than their competitors. And the second is they're using airplanes to ship, literally filled up airplanes to ship this product. And air freight for apparel is probably 40 times more damaging in terms of emissions as compared to shipping things by sea. And so we all lose twice. We don't get the tax revenue associated with those shipments at the federal level, and the planet loses because the way they're doing it is more destructive.
Right. You've also talked about something interesting, is that unlike older consumers, Gen Zers don't start their shopping journey with an end in mind. So it's a very different group of shoppers.
Well, yes, I think it's hard to generalize to everyone, but mostly shopping has become a form of entertainment. Temu is actually, if you go on their site, they've really figured this out. They've gamified the process of shopping with, roulette wheels that spin and offer discounts and points for loyalty, and kind of created an atmosphere that's carnival-like around shopping, that makes it more fun and appealing and addictive.
Yeah, and you've also said that young people shop in a different way. It's what you've called social discovery, which is different than someone who goes out to get a pair of shoes because their shoes wore out, so they have to shop for it. This is very different.
Yeah, shopping itself has become a way to connect. There are these videos that are online on TikTok and elsewhere called hauls. That's why Amazon called their new line of business Amazon Haul, where people actually take videos of themselves unboxing, 10 different items from Shein, and trying them on and trying to get their friends excited around the same thing. And it's become a phenomenon, a social phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Well, just one of my last questions: how does Shein specifically inveigle young people into buying? I mean, how is their reach so profound? What are all the things?
I think there's a misconception that it's just young people. It's not. If you look at the data, who buys Shein, they sell across demographics. It's not just Gen X or Gen Z. I think most people appreciate products that cost less. And so, you can buy more of something. And if our psyches, our zeitgeist, our images are based on, what we buy and how we look, the ability to buy more and to transition quicker has become something the industry's conditioned people to.
Mm-hmm. Right. What do you think is going to happen? Shein is aiming to go public in London in the first half of this year. Do you think that's going to happen?
I don't have any way of knowing. They tried to go public in the United States about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, and the SEC ultimately did not provide the okay. And so they shifted their sites to London. They raised money from private investors at a valuation of $66 billion. And they were trying to go public at a valuation between 90 and 100 billion. And the most recent rumors are that their valuation has become far less attractive, and it's closer to 30 billion now. That's still not nothing, but relative to 100, it's down considerably. And much of that decline is because the US is now imposing tariffs on China. The US is in the process of closing that de minimis loophole. Investigations have revealed that Shein has produced clothing that has high levels of toxicity, that there's over 100 different brands and people that are suing Shein for intellectual property appropriation. And there's concerns about the vast environmental damage that the brand is causing.
Yes. Well, Ken, I have like a million more questions on decarbonization and degrowth and, so many things. We're just going to have you back again for Kenneth Pucker Part 2. So I'm sorry to say that we are now out of time, and we could clearly go on and on to get to the bottom of your well of experience. It's been a really great learning experience for me, reading about you and listening to your podcasts and webinars. And I'm sure this will be a good learning experience for anyone listening today. And it's also been a real pleasure to meet you, Ken. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I have enormous respect for your organization and the spirit of Earth Day. And so as we approach Earth Day again this year, I hope we can remind ourselves of all the that kind of activism and kind of, I guess, idealism around preserving the planet for not ourselves, but the future, and be inspired by that.
Okay, that's just great. Okay, thank you, Ken.